এখানে কোনটা অফ আছে? হ্যাঁ, একটু দেখো। এটা দিয়ে দাও, যদি এটা this is on. ওটা off আছে। ওটা দিয়ে দাও। Sir, this is on. Okay. Thank you. এটা বন্ধ হয়ে গেছে।
All right. Is it time to start, or do we give them more time?
Hello. Okay. So, dear audience, distinguished panelists, honorable faculty members, and everyone who's present in the last session, the panel discussion that we're having on valuing natural assets. So, welcome back after the short break. So, before starting off with this panel discussion, I would like to share some words with all of you. The theme being valuing natural assets. So more and more countries and organizations are recognizing that economic profitability is not the only thing that matters, as seen in the COP26 Glasgow Climate Pact, as well as the World Bank's global program on sustainability that integrates environmental sustainability into public and private decisions by providing high quality data, analytical tools, and technical assistance of measuring and valuing natural capital and ecosystem services, while both the public and private sector would gain from the meaningful valuation of natural assets. Ecological budgets empower governments to account for the role of nature in economy and human well-being. It enables business to become more efficient, sustainable, and to minimize risks, as well as small farm holders and communities to make smarter decisions that generate financial value and responsibility of standing natural assets. The issue of natural capital debt has largely been ignored, where it is important to measure the cost of nature include indirectly in decision making as an evaluation of business assets against the model of extractive commodification of nature. So with that few words, I would like to modestly request our Ashok Khoshla sir, the Chairman Development of Alternatives India, the chair of this panel discussion, to start this discussion. So we also have Professor Parthodas Gupta, sir, on stage, along with Mr. Rakibul Amin, the country representative of IUC and Bangladesh. So at the end of this session, we're going to have a video message from Dr. Vandana Shiva, sovereignty leader, Navadanya, India. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. And I want to welcome the panel, which you've already introduced. Thank you all for joining us. We've had a day and a half of a lot of discussion on nature and economics, and even about leadership, about how the next generation is going to handle the world that's in such peril. And this session is about bringing some of those things together. Many of these things have been brought together in previous sessions, this morning, yesterday. But the issues of leadership and why leadership, issues of naturenomics and how conservation and economics need to come together in a different kind of way, are what we're going to discuss. Today, the world is a very threatened species of planets which are habitable, planets there that can sustain intelligent life. It's the only one we know for sure. There may well be others. The chances are that there are, but this is a unique opportunity to make life worthwhile. The situation we're in which both our life support systems on the one hand and our social systems and economic systems on the other are in pretty extreme peril. There are some 2 billion people who live on the subcontinent in South Asian region. Out of them, about 1 billion, close to 1 billion, could be properly called destitutes in one way or another. If you want to use World Bank definitions or the Oxford Poverty Index or whatever, it's probably around 800 million to a billion people who are really outside the mainstream economy. There are data from Oxfam which show that literally 8 billionaires, 8 individuals, have as much wealth as half the population of my country, of India. Whether these are off by a few percent here or there, it's not relevant. The point is that the inequity in our world is not only extreme, but it's very large scale and widespread. There's massive destruction of our natural resources and our environment. There's a massive demolition of social assets, social capital. The so-called demographic dividend is really an ephemera which we need to deal with, because it's seen from all our neighboring countries, from China to Korea to Japan, and indeed in other parts of the world, to be one that very quickly melts into a dependency debt burden. From the stage where we are right now, with some 50% of our population below the age of around 25, to the dependency ratio is basically inverted, is only a matter of 25, 30 years. We have one of India's top demographers here, and he may wish to contradict me, but all I can say is that it's not going to take very long before we will start needing to import young people to support the older ones. So these dividends, so-called dividends, are really not something you can rely very heavily on for taking us forward. So what is leadership? Why are we talking about leadership? It's about individual and institutional responsibility for proactive design and implementation of a better future. John Kennedy, at his inaugural, said, as most of you know, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. That was, in a sense, his idea of what leadership is meant to be. But I personally prefer what his younger brother said a few days before he was assassinated. Thank you. What Robert Kennedy said was, some men see things as they are and ask why. I dream of things that never were and ask why not. And I think that's a mark of the kind of leadership that we need today. And it comes, in a sense, from a particular part of society, which is called civil society, the NGOs of this world. And I'm going to make a case that they are very important in the work that we are discussing here today. Leadership and fundamental changes in behavior that we need in order to deal with the issues that we've been talking about for the last 24 hours are going to have to recognize that the assumptions of economics, of society that we have built our structures on are not good enough. And that's why civil society becomes very important. I'm going to try and make a case that we need a totally different kind of innovation, an innovation that we might call frugal innovation, that can bring the other half of the world into the mainstream economy, which mainstream economy will be substantially different from the one today, because it will be much more sensitive to its long-term implications of its actions. It will be one that deals much more urgently with the threats that we're talking about. Uh, the three big threats, or the five big threats, depending on which polythreat system you belong to, are all seeing us heading headlong towards a cliff of societal breakdown, of economic breakdowns, and indeed of the life support system breakdowns. So leadership means going against the current where um, democracy and the kinds of um, freedoms that people are now aspiring to can be met without destroying the basis of life on Earth. Um, the importance of doing this is partly because there is a certain amount of impotence in neoclassical economics that has been coming up in our conversation over here. Uh, and it's basically self-evident because it's the proof of the pudding is in the results, in the eating. And the results are pretty awful. So today, we can't say that the economic systems we adopted over the last two and a half centuries, 3 centuries, are adequate for the task of creating a world which is not only sustainable, but is geared to providing well-being and fulfillment to all citizens on our planet. It's partly because economics, the subject of economics and the profession of economics has put a huge amount of emphasis on concepts like efficiency, like the invisible hand and the need to adopt greed as a good behavior pattern. Uh, the need to grow. Growth is a very big commitment in economics. And Pata, I hope, will forgive me for quoting Kenneth Boulding, because every economist has heard this before. But Kenneth Boulding was a major economic mind, and he was president of the American Economics Association for several years. And he said that anyone who believes that you can grow perpetually on a finite resource base must be either a madman or an economist. Being an economist, he could get away with it. I may not get away with it because I'm not. But the fact is that those are fundamental gaps in the thinking of modern neoclassical economics, which really are the basis of large parts of our problem. For the economics profession generally, growth is all that you really need. Distributive justice isn't a part of the equation. They write books sometimes about growth with equity or whatever, but essentially, who gets the benefits and who pays the costs is not a major part of the economics curriculum. Another part of the problem is that the measurement of future value, which comes with discount rates, which are quite phony, they don't relate to reality, mean that the time horizons of economic calculations are very short. So they don't take account of issues like climate change and species extinction and so on. So efficiency is a runaway driver of the choice of production systems that we have and consumption systems. And the other side of that coin, sufficiency, is not adequately addressed. So when you have basically people who are into the kind of issues that you need in order to curb the onslaught that humanity is making on nature, then you have to have a science that addresses sufficiency as a problem, as a goal. So this, together with the commitment of our present economic systems on the primacy of capital in terms of its rights to the benefits of economic activity, is a major issue in this game. So we also need to recognize that defining what is a good life is a culturally dependent issue. Today, what is a good life is defined largely by Western economies, Northern economies that have pursued a certain kind of trajectory, and they don't necessarily reflect what other cultures um, see. And this issue of growth and efficiency are actually at the root cause of many of the problems that we're dealing with here. You know, that younger brother, Robert Kennedy, has a very famous quotation. It's rather long, and I won't read it out to you, which basically questions the whole value of GDP. He said, GDP judges the United States of America by a GDP that counts air pollution and cigarette advertising and ambulances to clear our highways of carnage. It counts special locks for our doors and the jails for the people who break them. It counts the destruction of our forests and the loss of our natural wonder in chaotic sprawl. It counts weapons and counts and armored cars for the police to fight the crime in our cities. It counts television programs which glorify violence in order to sell toys to our kids. Yet, the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. And this is what leadership is about, our devotion to our respective countries to make life better for our fellow citizens. And he goes on to say, and it tells us everything about America except what we are proud of, that we are Americans. And if this is true of America, it's certainly true of other places as well. So I read that out for you because, frankly, our view of a better economic future is very single-minded and rather narrowly conceived. Future causes that we're going to have to deal with are jobs, livelihoods, lifestyles, consumption patterns, production systems, managing our wastes, living with the natural resource base that we have, trade, aid, on all the other things that economics has to deal with. But in order to do that, we've got to have a very different approach that in thought and in action that comes from recognizing the root causes of our problems. And almost all of the problems have root causes which are very basically either the same or very similar. The leverage to change the direction that we're taking has to come from passion and from strategy, and also have the depth and the scale that is needed to meet the challenge, the magnitude of the challenge. So I think what I'm going to make a case for is that in order for us to have the leadership to change course of our ship of state, it has to come from the third strand, if you like, of society. Just as in DNA, you have two strands, in society you have three strands. There's the public, the government, the private sector, the market, the people sector, which is called civil society. And while the private and the public are going to go on fighting each other and creating more and more disturbance in the environment, the social and economic environment, it is for the people's sector, the civil society, that you're going to have to drive a way of bridging these two to bring about change. So the real leverage is going to need collaboration. It's going to need support systems. We call all this sort of an ecosystem for governance, and that needs a strong civil society, which includes all kinds of organizations that are neither government nor private sector, and it brings together nature and economics in a wholly different way. And civil society is the one that has actually more or less on its own created almost all the valuable changes that have occurred in our world. The changes regarding gender equality, the changes requiring universal suffrage, the changes about human rights. These don't come from governments and they don't come from big business. They actually come from civil society. The kinds of organizations that the Balipara Foundation represents and my own organization, Development Alternatives, these are extremely important, and they are today under incredible threat. They're under threat almost in every country around the world from establishments that are now becoming more and more autocratic and very sensitive to criticism or independent thinking. And I believe that we've got to address not only the issues, but the instruments that we need in order to bring those issues together. So that is basically what I think we should be discussing. What is the need for leadership? What is the kind of mechanism? And it's not enough to say we need to build skills or we need mentoring, because that, of course, is a way of doing that. But what kind of skills and what kind of mentoring are important? So may I open the floor and invite Professor Partha Dasgupta to address these issues.
Ashok, I'm afraid you've got me in a bind, because this session was about valuation. As far as
you can talk about valuation, it says leadership address for valuation of natural resources.
So I think I'll speak.
You should speak about what you were going to say.
Fine, I will speak, give you a sense of the way my mind has been working over issues of valuation, because I know something about it. The history of my own understanding of it. Oh, so sorry. Is that better? Oh, good. I'm so sorry. Yes, I should know better than that. Okay, I'll be trying to be brief, and so that I have to leave by 1:45. The subject of environmental and resource economics really developed in the United States to begin with, and that's an unfortunate phenomenon, and I'll come to that in a minute. The reason is that, very understandably, the young people there who worked on it, or the elderly people who took were leaders of civil society in creating public parks, national parks, and so forth, dating back to the 19th century, were concerned essentially with amenities. These were rich societies. They saw a natural capital in the form of lakes, beaches, parks, endangered species, rare species, and they wanted to protect them. So the first set of valuation exercises in the United States, and then it came over to England and the continent as well, were over the valuation of amenities. Find out ways by which you can tease out the willingness to pay, the value of it, as seen by people. After all, these are democratic societies, remember. So the valuation is going to reside in the heads of people. So why not ask them or find out from their behavior how they value it? So it's an incredibly large literature developed in the 60s, 70s, running into the 80s on valuation methods of amenities, essentially amenities, okay? Say parks, fishing places where you could fish, cleaning up pollution. So if there was a beach You wanted to clean it up. It costs money. How do you do that? What's the value of doing that? And you go and ask people. So methods were developed in teasing out the willingness to pay. Several particular forms of it, for example, contingent valuation exercises involved actually asking people, random sample of people, as to how much they're willing to pay for the value to protect the resource in question. Okay, that is actually the largest group of papers were on this field, and textbooks and so forth. So somebody like myself who first entered the field about the late 70s, and I was interested in it, coming from this part of the world, of course, I found that to be not very exciting because I saw natural capital as more as a means, the engine of life, so to speak. And I thought of the fisherman, the woodlander, or the farmer. For him or her, the resource in question had some productivity, and how do you tease out the productivity in a world in which markets malfunction in a big way? Okay? The large-scale work on this, which has come up, I haven't myself contributed. I did the theoretical work, which gives you the formulae that you need in order to be able to estimate the productivity of, let us say, a wetland. And you ask yourself, what is the wetland producing in terms of goods and services that people need, and whether they are people in a community or downstream and so forth. The bulk, some of the most interesting work that's been done has actually, not surprisingly, been done in this part of the world, under the aegis of SANDI, the South Asian Network for Development and Environmental Economics, which is now about 22 years old. And one of the leaders of that, one of the big mentors of that program, is Professor Huck, Inamul Huck, who was here yesterday. And he's been spearheading much of the research, and some of it were published in a volume of essays about 10 years ago. And what did it amount to? Well, if you ask for agricultural land, for example, and you ask what's the value of that, well, as a first cut, you could look for the market price, if there was a market price for it, because it's giving you some transactional value that comes out of the agricultural land based on what it can produce, the flow of output from it. So we're looking at an asset. An asset has a flow of benefits that can come over time, services that come over time. So what the idea is to be able to work out what those benefits are, take a present value of it, and gives you something like the value of the stock. Okay. But what about something like an open access space, let's say a wetland or a mangrove forest, which doesn't have a market value? Now then you ask yourself the question, or at least the economist asked them the questions, what are the services that are provided, and can you value those services? So in the case of a wetland, for example, take at least two values. One would be the cleansing of the water that a wetland provides, natural cleansing processes. And one way of thinking of it is, what benefits does that have to the people in the neighborhood, A? And B, if it's deteriorating, you might ask, well, what's the replacement cost? The replacement cost could be a filtration plant. You can see how difficult the question is once you pose it, and yet you have to find shortcuts, some ways around it. And a classic example of valuation there was done in the Catskill Mountains, which supplied clean water to the citizens of New York. And it's remarkably clean water coming out, because the water was cleaned by the watershed, as the water traveled along the watershed. Of course, that had deteriorated through development and came to a point where New York City's water supply was threatened. Polluted water was coming. So one way of valuing it was to see there were two possibilities. One is to regenerate the Catskills. Okay, so that's the restoration, if you like. And the other is, well, New York needs clean water. What about a filtration plant? There's a classic example, because it turned out the filtration plant was hugely expensive, 8 billion or so. I'm now talking about 1980s crisis. And of course, the decision was made to restore the Catskill. So this is one of the big success stories of it. And the reason I mention it is that it gives you how the economists can find their way into trying estimating the productivity of an ecosystem in terms of the goods and services it provides. come back to a wetland, one thing is cleaning of water, okay? So I've given you a sense of how we might go on estimating the value of that. On top of that, it of course houses insects and all sorts of potential pollinators. Well, then you ask yourself the question, what's the value of that pollination? And you then look for neighboring farmland and see whether you can use data there to see what the value of these pollinators is. And you can imagine that economists have done that as well. What they've done is to have looked in one particular case, neighboring farms, but distance away from, and gradients of distance away from the wetland in question, and to see whether other things remaining. These are serious econometric problems because you have to hold things constant and then control for other things. And what you found was actually that the productivity of the pollinators, the benefit that pollination gave to the farms was a declining function of the distance of the farm from the wetland itself, which is very understandable because, of course, these pollinators fly, but they don't fly forever. They have a disc range. So the farther you are, you're getting less benefit. But you can then work out what the productivity benefits were. Add them up, and that gives you a first cut at the value of the ecosystem. And of course, one can go on. And as I say, Sandy has done marvelous work on this. For example, on shrimp farms, which have huge environmental problems to neighboring adjacent farms. Okay, and what the volume that Professor Huck edited has an extremely interesting exercise in trying to estimate the losses to the neighboring farmers due to the damage caused by the shrimp farm, which you then want to deduct from the value of the shrimp farm. And of course, the shrimp's price doesn't reflect the damage, which comes back to the point I was trying to make earlier, that export of primary products carries with it a cost which is not picked up in the export price. So in a sense, the exporting country and our primary products lose out. So that's the background of that story. Okay, so I've talked about these are use value. I'm going to end with a couple of remarks on things which I find very difficult to get my grip on for valuation purpose, but I understand their significance as well as anybody else does. What about the intrinsic value of species or even ecosystems? Not just, a willingness to pay. That's, after all, my assessment of what I value. But is there something called an intrinsic value of it? For people of this part of the world, our culture, the culture we're brought up in, that's much easier to digest, the idea of an intrinsic value, than many of my friends in the West, because we are, for a variety of reasons, I'll come to one or two of them. Then amongst, because you can ask people as to whether something which is not an amenity, you don't actually observe that object or that species, let's say pelicans in a distant part of the world, are you willing to pay for the preservation of the pelican species? And there have been very interesting case studies of that, where people have revealed a willingness to pay some for the protection of something which they will never see. So it's an intrinsic value that they were trying to estimate, okay, or impute. To me, coming from where I do, which is India, a far more tricky one and far more moving and important one was the sacred value of certain types of ecosystems. And it doesn't even have to be, it could be a rock, but the rock is this ecosystem too. And for example, the big rock in Australia is a sacred land for the Aborigines. And there I think we come to grips with something which is very hard to accommodate, and certainly nobody would wish to put a price on it. Right? Sacred is sacred, thus far no farther. It's quota constraints, you don't tamper it and so forth. And we understand it. And in some deep sense, I would argue that the issue of valuation, which when I was doing my review, one of the first criticisms was that here we go again, here's an economist trying to value nature and you can't put a value on nature. That was immediate criticism that came when I was appointed to produce the review. But of course, that's, in a way, it's an armchair aristocratic view of the matter. Because, for example, the wonderful talk we had from the gentleman from Nagaland, for them, for really traditional households, traditional communities, nature has always had a value. There's intrinsic value, and they were not going to put this, they said, this is relative, the relative price of this is so much relative to something else. They wouldn't put it that way. That's not that their language. Their language would be there has to be some balance. And we don't touch this part of the ecosystem at this season because this is not the right season. We do something else in another part of the, but that reasoning has in it trade-offs. That's saying keeping the balance means you're judging relative values. Okay, so these are not alien notion, but the sacredness one does interest me very much for the following reason, and I'll give you example of it. Every society that I have come across, and I've traveled a lot, we rationalize our actions when they come in they create conflict among values that we hold. We want this and we want that. We can't have both. But we don't like the idea that we're giving up one for the sake of the other. And so we fudge the issue and create a word play in which actually we are not actually giving up either. The classic example for me, given that I was raised in Benares, Varanasi, is the Ganges, which is about as sacred an ecosystem, if you want to call it an ecosystem, for Hindus as any. We call her Ma Ganga. It's as simple as that. Okay. It's yet one of the most polluted rivers on earth. You name the trash and it's dumped into it. Okay. So here we go. We have competing demands. You have a sacred river, and yet you're polluting it. You're doing it very consciously because there are no alternatives, let us say, in this case. Okay. I raised this question some years ago when I was in Benares with my son who wanted to visit Benares. I was raised there. And we went to the ghats, and people were bathing and everything. And of course, you saw some arms and legs floating down the water because the burning ghats were on the, and it was filthy, absolutely filthy at that part in Benares. And there was a priest who was praying, and after he finished his prayer, I saw him and I asked him, what do you make of it? You're praying to this river, and yet it's so filthy, and people are dumping it and not showing any respect. What do you make of it? He looked at him, he smiled, and he said, you're wrong. It's not filthy. She's a goddess, she's Ma Ganga. She cannot be polluted. That was the end of the story. That's the rationalization I mentioned, that we have to come to terms with things which contradict each other, and we rationalize somehow. I thought it was a very profound answer, actually, because there's nothing he could do. And the fact is that it was going to remain polluted unless some concerted effort was made to change the incentives, get the prices right so that people don't actually, the chemical companies do not dump the stuff in it. So I'll stop here because I think the sacredness of much of nature is something we have really we have lost, but traditional societies have maintained it in a big way. And they did it because from an economist's point of view, it's a way of pricing a good out of the market, so to speak, if you like. It's a rational way of telling a story. But of course, this is not what a religious person would agree to. But a non-believer can see this as well as a conservation measure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Fascinating. I came to actually listen to both of you because I always look. I mean, gurus in environmentalism and environmental economics. Karishma just put me in. They said that please do also participate in the conversation. So I'm not an economist, I must say. Just to follow up what Dr. Dasgupta has mentioned, I was in Indonesia. We are doing some community planning in the mangrove area. There's a small islands and not Sulawesi, so not so far away is a mountain. and the streams are coming from the mountain, and the rivers were really, really filthy. And the same question was like, I was asking, like, what's happening? He said that the participants say that the central government has given concession for the mining in the hilltop. So they're cutting all the trees. They're mining and some mercury and all the, mostly gold mine and other mines. So, and they are suffering. So though the community has a sacred value attached to the mountain, and they want to preserve, but there are higher authority who has from the Jakarta has given concession to the mines, and this is beyond their capacity. They, in such a situation, uh, you know, what what is the answer? Um, you know, in such a situation where, like, there's a value, an intrinsic value that the community attached to the mountain versus the market value that the central government thinks is a transaction. Uh, how do we as a conservationist can change the course? So that maybe if you highlight on that, give some wisdom, that would be great. And also coming back to Bangladesh, it has been our tradition not to fish during a breeding season, all throughout. Slowly, it degrades, various reasons: demographic change, poverty, pressure, whatever. Now, the government has imposed a fishing ban during the breeding season and also a 60-day ban in the sea. Initially, there was a lot of hue and cry. There was a lot of debate, like whether this is scientific, whether this is against the human rights. What about this poor fisherman? Government has provided that ration during that area. Initially, there was some issues, but eventually, and it's become systematized, and we see the Hilsha has bounced back, and we could send some to India as a present as well. Um, so the traditional practice has to be supplemented or been imposed with punitive measures, with structural measures. So these are two examples. Maybe Dr. Dasgupta and Dr. Khosla. eh, what is an advice for us in terms of when we are trying to project the value of conservation, we are trying to implement, move the societies to uphill this intrinsic value, but it's extremely, extremely hard. So, what is your advice?
Well, sorry, I'm not a problem solver for everything. But one of the things I became absolutely convinced with towards the end of my the period I was writing my the review, and it's one of the strongest recommendations in the review, is particularly with growing urbanization, there's an extremely strong case for altering our educational system. I was looking at it from, of course, from the UK point of view, since I was writing for the UK Treasury, that we have at the primary school, we have the 3 R's, the compulsory, reading, writing, and arithmetic, but we ought to have nature studies as a 4th component to it. And then this should continue right through the educational system, right through this tertiary education as well. It's particularly important for growing the urban population. But there is this real reason behind my reasoning, and which I want to share with you, and it'll be very brief. In my talk yesterday, in my lecture, I mentioned that there are 2 essential features of Mother Nature and her activities under the soil, deep in the oceans, in the rivers, where you can't see, is that these processes are silent and they're invisible. That means really there are no institutional solutions to these overuse of these services, the pressure we are putting in. And the reason is that every institution, for it to work, needs to know who is responsible for what, and to have some form of penalty or reward system. It can happen through the legal system, of course, that's the West. In traditional societies, like in Nagaland, it would be social norms of behavior. There's no legal system in the strict sense of the term, in the normal course. It will be norms of behavior which are kept in check by social sanctions. You don't do this, you don't do that, you can't do this, and so forth. But either way, you need to be able to have some confirmation of who did what. That is to say, you can either observe or you can verify. But if these are silent and invisible, you can't do anything. A person can get away with destroying a bit of the source of the supply. And for that reason, it occurred to me that the only way we can discipline, it has to be self-discipline. We have to be the judge and jury of our own actions. And that's easy to say, but it might be doable if you actually care about that object, if you feel there's something intrinsic value in it. And then, of course, you don't do it. How do you get that? Perhaps by understanding what it is. That's where the education comes in, where the science comes in, to understand the workings of this incredibly complex and yet mysterious goings on that Mother Nature has. And unless we get the sense of that happening, we won't have the sense of awe for nature. And hence, I think the solution in some deep sense has to be, if we have time, that is. I mean, I don't know if we have 30, 40 years left, but if we do, we should, in principle, be able to really rejuvenate our educational system so that we, all of us, throughout our lives, can eventually become naturalists in our, at least in part, when we have a leisure time. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what.
In one sense, what you just said means that leadership, somebody who's making a decision,
Yes,
is going to basically, hopefully, make the trade-offs that you were talking about. We went through a specific example of this over the last few years in dealing with bricks. Red bricks, burnt bricks, use 1.5 kilos of topsoil, really precious commodity, competing with food production and all kinds of other long-term values. And the only way we could deal with this was not through the market pricing mechanisms that you related, either because of the productivity or the willingness to pay, because all those were going in the wrong direction. And we had to get the government of Bihar actually to prohibit the manufacture of red bricks. Now, the valuation issue was at a very high level. We could convince the ministers that they were losing out in the long run. And so you really don't have the market able to deal with that on its own. And so we've really actually got to figure out a way in which the business people and the consumers make the right decisions. And that's not something that's happening. You actually have to use regulation, prohibition, in fact, in this case, to do the right thing. And what is the right thing to do? Basically, that it should have a long-term view. And that isn't built into the current economic system. So it took what you might call an enlightened advocacy to actually do the right thing. And a lot of people probably suffered from that because the construction industry obviously goes into tailspin and a lot of other things. Same applies to mining, to all kinds of other issues.
In all fairness, Ashok, there have been prohibitions imposed in other contexts in other countries. For example, there are bans on fishing in certain parts of the world, and there are protection of endangered species acts. So those are prohibitions too. I mean, I'd like to see this happening more and more, which is the point you're making, absolutely, because the market is not going to be supplying it. You can't really use a price system for these when you're near the tipping point, when you're near the precipice. You don't worry about prices. You say, no, we're not going to do it.
And that's what we were able to do. But you see, if you are talking about valuing natural assets, you have to have a methodology that actually permeates itself into the market at some point. And that's, we don't have at the moment. We don't. The one we do have is a calculation which gives you a short-term solution which is probably the wrong one. Okay, any questions from the participants? Can somebody bring up?
Someone behind? No? Thank you. I think I enjoyed this session. There are two challenges that I see are for naturonomics, and also when you're thinking of evaluating the natural assets. And both the issues came up very significantly. You see, Dr. Khosla, you were talking about coordination across different agencies for doing proper validation of the results. I think it's also very important that we have coordination and integration of different data sets. We need essentially, if you're really doing the valuation and naturonomics, you need socioeconomic data. We need the data on the natural assets coming from the, satellites. Now, I've been working on the data. I was responsible for setting up the State Statistical Commission in Madhya Pradesh last month. I was chairing that committee. It's becoming clear that we are using the natural resources data at the macro level, just for some kind of a cross-checking or gross validation. But we are not taking the data at the disaggregative level, so there is no analytical, relationship between the two data sets. And I must tell you, the State Statistical Commission, despite our recommendation in Madhya Pradesh, which was just talked in a big way in the earlier session, has kept the natural resources data out of the State Statistical Commission. And I must tell you, in even simple identification of urban centers, globally we are talking about bringing in the satellite data, built up area, then vegetations. And I was advising the Sri Lankan government, and they have adopted to some extent the satellite data in identifying the urban centers. But Indian government has not done that. So what is really unfortunate that we are talking about valuation, and I'm really grateful to Professor Partho Dasgupta's work and his other colleagues that they have given us a methodology for intertemporal, interregional comparisons. Certainly these are very important things if the data sets are not talking to each other at a grassroots level. And the recent report submitted to the Niti Aayog says that in the 60s, 70% of the data from the state level was coming at the district level and 30% was allocated. Now it is 70% allocation and 30% is generated from the local level. We know about Himalayan regions, how as far as the satellite data is concerned, there is no problem. But we have no knowledge about the livelihood impact of the COVID, how the migration has been affected in this region. So we can't really do a proper valuation of the economies of these areas except in through allocation method for the Himalayan regions. Just one more minute I will take. Since we are bringing in the leadership issues also. American president says, American lifestyle is not negotiable in the global platform. I was in Germany, a minister for Germany says, look, Professor Kundu, we are not responsible for what our forefathers did. So you don't think that, the burden of compensating is like it was. And secondly, our forefathers had no idea about global warming. In a meeting in Indonesia, on European Union minister, he gave an interesting suggestion. And that was something, he said, yes, we agree that the rich have a burden of really taking care of their environmental issues. But rich in every country should pay the same kind of thing. A rich in Delhi, New York, in Philadelphia, or in, Dhaka should not be treated differently. The rich and the poor, yes, we make a distinction, but we don't make a bit distinction across the countries, which really means implicitly that the European Union should dictate what kind of taxation policies should third world countries have. It is the responsibility of their countries to decide about their tax structure. They can't just say that unless you reform your tax structure in this particular manner, we are not taking the responsibility of, compensating for this, shift,
Thank you.
paradigm shift. I
Thank
thought
you.
that these are some of the critical issues, and certainly we look forward to people who are working in the front line of this to tell us how do we go about operationally.
Thank you. You have to run. I'm afraid Professor Dasgupta has to go. We'll see you, I hope, soon. Okay, bye. Are there any other comments or questions or responses to Professor Kundu's comments? Would you like to? Any other questions? Do we have that video ready from Dr. Vandana Shiva? Yeah, we can have the video.
Hello. Yes. So thank you very much, sir, for your valuable message and everything. So now we'll have a video message from Dr. Vandana Shiva. I would like to request our tech team to play the video message. Thank you.
Well, given that I've spent 50 years of my 70-year life trying to protect the earth, her biodiversity, her forests, her agricultural crops, the state of the world is dismal when it comes to the dominant trend, which is promoted by big money, big ignorance, big thoughtlessness. But there is another emerging trend, and that emerging trend is to work with nature as part of nature. And that trend is what holds the seeds to the future. I've done a whole book on who really feeds the world for the Food Summit in Italy in 2015. And my research, my practice has shown me that the land feeds the world, the soil feeds the world. Dead, desertified soils can grow no food. That's why any action that harms the living soil is a food security threat. Biodiversity feeds the world. Our work in Navdanya has shown that the more intensification we have of biodiversity, the more we have of productivity, the more we have of incomes, the more we have nutrition and health per acre. Women feed the world because most of the farmers of the world are women. And on very tiny acreages, women grow much more food. For example, in Nigeria, on 2% land, women grow half the food. On 50% of the land, but male farmers grow about 2% of the food. Food requires care. Agriculture means care for the land. So biodiversity feeds people, soil organisms feed people, pollinators feed people. Our research shows that 1/3 of the food we eat has been co-created by the pollinators. And these are the actors we never take into account when we think of food production. We think of giant combine harvesters. We think of drone spraying Roundup. That is killing food. That's killing life. I grew up in India before the fossil fuel age, before the chemical age, before the Green Revolution. And in our work in Navdanya of regenerating biodiversity, we have found that everything that petrochemicals and fossil fuels produce can be done better by plants and biodiversity. So the potential of restoration of the land with biodiversity regeneration is huge for livelihood generation, for healing the earth, and even healing the broken climate system. This is the place to heal our broken health system, because the more diverse your food, the more healthy is your diversity of gut microbiomes, 100 trillion of them. My advice to young people of today is, first, shed the hierarchies that have occupied your mind. the hierarchies of gender, that men are superior to women, of race, that white is somehow superior to any color, of religions, of anthropocentrism, that humans are somehow superior to the rest of life, the hierarchy of occupation, that sitting on a desk is somehow superior to being part of the earth. Become the earth again, grow a garden, become a farmer, plant a forest. There are two future worlds. I'm trained in quantum theory. Uncertainty and multiple possibilities is what I see for real. We have a possibility of devastating this planet further, creating more climate catastrophes, pushing more species to extinction. We've already reached 200 million a day. Sorry, we've already reached 200 a day, a million threatened. But we have another possibility of which we can be a part, of regenerating the earth, restoring the land. That possibility has an amazing partner, the earth herself. We are tiny elements, tiny members of the earth family. If we stop the harm we are doing with our arrogance and start playing a humble role in the food web and in the web of life, this earth will regenerate as she has, cycle after cycle, and we will be part of that regeneration. We can either be part of the collapse or we can be part of the restoration.
Thank you. I guess if there are no more points to be made by any of the audience, we will break for. Go ahead.
Hello. Okay. So thank you very much, sir, for your valuable time and sharing your precious ideas and thoughts and insights with all of us. So now we're at the end of today's session. So I'd like to thank all of you here who are present, and I'd like to also thank all of you who has worked very hard to make this session a reality. I would like to thank the team members of Bali Para, the team members of our administrative uh, uh, side, and also friends from the media. And thank you for your time, patience, and presence here. So before wrapping up today's event, I would like to invite you all to our tomorrow's panel discussion, which will be held at this auditorium at 9:30 in the morning. Thank you all.